I'm using a little Singer circular knitting machine to demonstrate how to do the short rows for heels and toes on socks. And I've got the machine stabilized on my table using command tape, and it holds it pretty steady, and then all I have to do is pull the tab to remove it off of the table if I don't want it on here anymore. So the first step that you need to do is determine how long you want the leg of your sock to be, and do a closed edge cast on like an E-wrap, which I've done here, and do whatever rib pattern you want. I did a 1x1 rib all the way down to the ankle on this sock. So I'm going to go ahead and knit a few rounds of just a small leg portion, just so we can get started on the short row. This machine has no markings for the needles with numbers on them, and also it did not have needles that were designated as the center needles. So I marked one of my needles with a Sharpie marker. If you want to use the flat panel lever on this machine, you'll have to figure out which needle is number 1. On this one I just picked any needle. On most sock patterns you're going to be using half of your stitches for the heel and the toe. On mine I'm going to use the same set of needles for the heel as for the toe, and that will put the seam of the toe on the top of the toe. When you get finished knitting the toe, you're going to have this gap across the top that you're going to have to graft together with a needle. I've knitted a few rows to represent the leg portion of the sock, and you're going to need to mark your stitches in some way, and I'm using a dry erase marker. This one is an Expo marker, and you can use it to mark anywhere on the machine that you need to, and the markings come right off. So that is what I'm using today instead of stitch markers. And you can keep a Q-tip handy so that you can get in there and erase the markers when the time comes. Also, you're going to need some sort of a hook to pull on your yarn. You can use crochet hook or a long needle or anything that you can get in there and pull on that yarn. So the first thing I'm going to do is decide how many needles I want to do the heel on, and this sock was done on 15 needles. That's why it comes up a little bit more than half. Normally you're going to use half of your needles, but I watched a video online and she recommended going a few more needles to give the heel a little bit more room, and so I'm going to use 15 needles. To do the math on that, when you decide how many needles that you're going to be using for the heel, you would divide it in thirds, and in my case that would be 5 needles. So I'll have 5 needles that I'm going to do the short row technique on, 5 needles that is going to be the middle of the heel, and 5 needles on the other side of the heel that's going to be the rest of the short row technique. What we're going to be doing is working on all of these needles to the left of this center needle and going and stopping short and coming back until we complete the heel. And then we're going to increase back out again for the bottom of the heel and then work our way toward the foot, and then the toe will be done in exactly the same way. So if you choose less than 15 needles and you come up with an odd number like 13, you can do 4, 4, and 5, like do 4 short rows on each side, and then, or 4 wrapped needles on each side, and then do 5 that are not wrapped in the middle. So just work out the math for however many needles that you're going to be using. So I'm going to start counting from this center needle clockwise around to needle number 15. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. If your machine has numbers on it, you can just keep a notepad handy and just write down the needles that you've wrapped, and you don't even have to do this. Or you can hang stitch markers on the back if you want to do that. So I'm going to knit forward until I get close to that needle. So just when the hook just pops up enough for me to get to it, that's when I'm going to stop. So now the hook is exposed. I don't want to let this loop, I don't want to let it drop out of the hook. I want it to stay up there where it will not knit when I go back in the other direction. I don't want it to drop below the belly of the needle. So the first step is this is how you do the wrap and turn. You pull out a long loose loop of thread or yarn. You flip it over to where the working yarn that's coming off of the ball of the yarn is on the bottom. Pass it in front of these needles, making sure that you're keeping this strand in front of these two needles. You take the loop and you wrap it or hook it into the needle that you marked. Pull out some slack over here too, because when you start knitting back in the other direction, this is going to tighten up and cause trouble later. So keep them exaggeratedly loose for now. I'm going to, before I do anything else, I'm going to map out where I need to go next. So here's my center needle, and we're working back and forth right here. So I'm going to mark actually the center needle, which is already marked. So just symbolically, I'm going to mark it. That's where I'm going next. I'm going to crank in reverse just a little bit, just to anchor those loops. I use this needle to kind of anchor things. I go ahead and pull on the working yarn just to snug that up. Do not pull it tight, just neaten it up a little bit on the back. These next three needles that are beyond the needle that we wrapped, this is 1, 2, and 3, they're all going to have a double strand of yarn going underneath them, and this needle will be normal. Go ahead and make sure when you're knitting that that double loop or the double strand stays under the hooks of those three needles. If it wants to drop below the belly of the needle, go ahead and encourage it back up into the hook, and that way it won't tighten things up around these sinker posts. And as you're knitting back in the other direction, watch the needles that are approaching the yarn guide and make sure that their loops are dropping down over these little teeth. Make sure they're dropping over the belly and into those little teeth. Right now they're going to behave, but after we get a lot of loops built up on these needles, they're not going to want to behave at all because they're going to have too many loops on their hooks. So I'm going to slow down when I'm getting to the needle I need to wrap, and I'm going to expose the hook so I can wrap this needle. I'm going to flip it over, pass it in front of all those needles, hook it into the hook of the needle that's marked, loosen it up on the other side, crank forward, adjust, and continue while watching all of the needles and making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do. But before I go farther, I need to map out where I'm going. So I'm going to mark the next needle on the other side, which is going to be in this area that is to the left of my needle number 1. They're all going to be on this side. So my next needle is here, not here. So I'm going to go forward till I get back to that needle again. Kind of smeared on there. Now I'm going to expose that hook of that needle. Get a big loop here, flip it, put it in front of the hooks of these needles, put the loop over that needle that's marked, loosen that up, crank in reverse, but let's go ahead and mark our next needle. I still have some old marks left from before that I need to go ahead and get rid of. And also, if you want to, you can go ahead and mark the tops of these here if it'll help you to remember which needles you're not using. But you just have to remember to remove the mark so it doesn't come off on your yarn. So I'm going to anchor that a little bit and then snug that up. I still have enough looseness here to be taken up. If you'll watch, all of that's going to be completely taken up and tightened up. So it'll get into trouble if you don't leave enough yarn there. So I'm going to help these needles along, which they're not really having any trouble right now. I just want to make sure. And I'm going to stop and wrap this needle right here. And I'm going to continue doing this until I have 5 needles marked and wrapped on each side. Flip, hang the loop in there, loosen everything up, mark my next needle, move forward a little bit, adjust that loop, and continue on to my next needle that needs to be wrapped. And I'm going to do a few more and then I'll be back. I've just wrapped my 4th needle on this side, so I'm going to crank forward and I'm going to be wrapping my 5th and last needle on this side. And then I'm going to mark the 5th and last needle on this side. So this will be the last wrap, so I'll have 5 and 5, and then I'll have 5 needles that knitted normally. So we're going to go on to the next step before I go any farther. What we need to do now, I'm going to be knitting forward anyway, so I'm just leaving my wrap just the way it is until I decide what I want to do next. If you had changed color for the heel, you would be knitting this differently than we did here. If you do the complete rounds and you've done the heel in a different color, you're going to end up with a band in the middle. So there's going to be probably another video later where I can show you how I changed colors without having that band around the middle. But for now we need to make sure that all of these needles have only one loop on them before we start the short row increase. We just finished the short row decrease from the leg down to the heel, and now we need to increase back out again to join up with the foot of the sock. So what I'm going to do is work my way back toward my center needle, but I'm going to go ahead and knit the needles that we didn't allow to knit earlier because I'm going to go completely tubular with this. So I'm going to get rid of these marks so they don't get on my yarn. This is just a sample, so it doesn't really matter. And I'm going to go ahead and clean up this last wrap that I did, making sure that all these trouble spots go through like they need to, all the ones that have extra loops on them. And I'm going to work my way back to that center needle. And we're knitting the needles that were never wrapped here. So I'm back to the center. So these needles still have double loops on them or these extra ones that still have the markings, because we haven't actually gone past them yet. But I'm going to go ahead and start my short row increase over here, so I can go ahead and knit past these needles and get to the other side of the heel where I need to be. Okay, to familiarize yourself where we are, here's our beginning needle, and we're working our heel to the left and clockwise. All the way to here is our heel section. These 15 needles to the left and clockwise from this center needle. As I mentioned before, we got to knit past these needles here, and we're going to stop when we get to this needle over here, and we're going to start removing marks. And this has built up quite a few rows in here compared to the other side, so if you need to, you can pull down on it or put some weight. So I'm going to go ahead and knit, making sure these knit correctly. Now when I get to that first marked needle, I'm going to go ahead and remove the mark because we are going to knit past it and stop short on the next needle, which means we're going to wrap the next needle. I don't like to remove my marks too soon. You can work out whichever way you want to do it, but for me it works better to not remove them until I'm ready to knit past them. So now I'm going to just wrap the next needle just like we always do. The hook is exposed, it's ready to be wrapped. I'm going to move. There's no needles to be marked now. We're unmarking, we're not marking. So the direction I'm going now is backwards to this needle. So I'm going to secure everything like I always do, and then work my way toward that needle, making sure that these needles knit correctly. I'm going to remove this mark and go ahead and let this needle knit. And I'm going to wrap the next needle. And I'm going to continue doing this back and forth until I have unmarked 4 needles on each side. Remember, I'm not going to unmark anything until I get to it. I went too far on that one. So this is the next needle that needs to be unmarked. And I'm going to go ahead and do that now and wrap this next needle. Work my way toward that needle. And I'm going to continue this, and I'll come back whenever I've got the 4 needles toward the end of getting those unmarked. I've wrapped the last marked needle on this side, and I'm working my way to the last needle that we're going to wrap on this side. So let me adjust this and get back over there. So I'm going to unmark this one because it's already been wrapped. You can see the wrap on it, and I'm going to wrap. See that wrap right there? If you lose count of where you've marked, you can always see your wraps. And I'm going to wrap this last needle. And then we'll move on to the next step. Even though we're not back to the beginning of the round, we can go ahead and start knitting the foot. And what you need to do is measure your foot and subtract 10%. Mine was 9 inches minus the 10% was about 8. And then you subtract 2 inches for the heel and 2 inches for the toe. So I ended up with 4 inches for my foot section, and I knitted about 22 rows for my foot. And since we're just going to be knitting a tube for the foot, we don't have to worry about these double loops anymore because they're going to knit. You just need to go slowly on the first round. We don't need any of our marks anymore. This one is permanent, so it's going to stay there. And so I'm just going to go really carefully on this first round and just make sure everything knits. Here's that double loop that needs to be above the belly, so because here's the wrap needle, 1, 2, 3. This third needle needs to have that double loop up into the hook of the needle. So just kind of help it along keeping your eye on everything for these first couple of rounds. And then you can just measure as you go till you get the length of the foot that you need. And I would start counting the rounds now so that you can do your second sock with the same number of rounds. I still haven't made it through all the trouble spots yet. You want to make sure your yarn is loose coming off the ball of the main yarn. Just continue knitting your foot until you get the length that you need. When you get finished knitting the length of your foot, you're going to start the short row technique for the toe and do it on the same needles that you did the heel, and complete until you get to the last needle that was wrapped and unmarked. And then you'll do one complete round to, and actually this will be open right here. You'll do one complete round around the toe, and that will clean up all of those extra loops on the needles. And then you can remove your work on waste yarn, and then you'll have a gap. You'll have waste yarn on this brown section. This is two colors, but yours will be solid. You'll have waste yarn completely around the open gap, and then you can graft the top of the toe together. There's a lot of videos online. I recommend Diana Sullivan's method of grafting, and it makes a nice flat invisible seam, and you won't feel any kind of seam against your toe because it's actually duplicating the knit stitch across the top of the toe. This is our finished heel before it's been blocked and steamed.